But we have two more talks left to go. And our next speaker is going to talk about a topic that is becoming more and more important in our industry, which is security and how that relates to privacy. Because we've all seen so many data leaks and problems with lack of security. And of course, we want to make sure that this doesn't happen to us. And I think this person is a good person to talk about that because he is very good at circumventing other people's security, specifically Apple's. And you probably know him a lot from finding and revealing a lot of information about upcoming Apple products. And it's funny because he's wearing a t-shirt from Apple Park, and I'm kind of surprised that they even let him on the premises. But anyway, he's also my co-host on the Stack Trace podcast. He's a really good friend. Please give a very warm welcome to Mr. Guy Rambo.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm super excited to be here. I actually flew directly from Canada, where I was speaking at NS North, another amazing conference. And so, as John mentioned, my talk is going to be all about privacy. I know the title it's like a marketing title, so don't be afraid of the title. So let's unlock this conversation. I want to talk about you. See what I did there? Isn't there a nice animation? I hope it's using core animation. So we see this phrase all the time. Here at Company X, we really care about your privacy and stuff like that. But isn't it funny that it's usually right after a huge data breach? Like millions of passwords stolen, we really care about your privacy. And then there's the famous security update post from some companies. They should be like insecurity updates because it's always after there's been a major blunder with user privacy. So what I want to talk about you today is what it really takes, first of all, for a company or a product or an individual to really care about their users' privacy, and also about some techniques we can use. So there's going to be some code, don't worry about it. It's not going to be an hour of like philosophy, nothing like that. So what does it take for us to care about the user's privacy? For me, it takes empathy. And you have to really care about your privacy, and you have to feel the same way about your users. And if you can do that, I think you can really care about privacy, for real, not just on press releases. So our mobile devices are getting more and more personal. You just have to look at how many stories there are of people saved by their Apple Watches because of the health features. And that's the sort of stuff that needs to be really private. But even if you're not working in health or any sensitive data, you have to care about your users' privacy. So let's see how we can go about it. And I'm going to divide this into three topics, which are data, transparency, and control. So I'm going to start with data. I'm going to explain them briefly right now. So data is about protecting the user's data, whether on device or in transit, or when it's stored in your servers or someone else's servers, which is usually the case. Transparency is about being clear to the user about the privacy implications of using your app, your product, or just a feature of your app or product. And control is about giving the users control over their data because it's their data, not your data. So let's start with data. And this is a big topic. Don't collect data you don't need. That's the best advice I can give here. You are responsible for the data you collect from your users. So if you don't need something, don't ask for it. Don't ask for permission you don't need. Don't ask for the user's real name if you don't need it. Just don't collect data you don't need. Do you need the user's location for your app to function or for a feature of your app to function? If the answer is no, don't collect the user's location. Simple as that. We've all seen this app. Like, you open the app for the first time, and it flashes all of these permissions on your face. So the way to approach something like this is, even if your app does need all of these permissions, I doubt it needs it right at launch. Like, wait a little bit. Like, let the user have a taste of your app without giving you any permissions. And then when they go to use a feature that needs extra permissions, you ask for them. Let's say you have some feature that uses the camera. Wait until the user wants to use the feature before you ask for camera permissions. Same with location. Basically, any permission the OS will give you. Be extremely careful with SDKs, especially if they're closed source. I mean, most of us here probably work for some sort of company, and they come up with these crazy enterprise SDKs or whatever you have to integrate in your apps. And some of them are quite scary, and they are like, you download them and it's not even over HTTPS, and they tell you to disable ATS, which we'll talk about in a bit. So be really careful. Like, if your app has access to the user's location, for instance, any framework linked to your app will also have access to the user's location. And that framework can be uploading the location to some server somewhere. It can be doing analysis over that data. It can be sending the data to the company for them to sell your users' data. I've even gotten emails. I have an app in the iOS App Store which has nothing to do with location, trust me. And I've received multiple emails already from companies that develop these SDKs that you can embed in your iOS app and enable access to user location, and they'll pay you for your user's location, even though your app doesn't need it. Fortunately, Apple is cracking down on these, but the opportunity is there. We just have to be ethical and not do it. Your app is your code. So if you have an SDK in your app that's misbehaving, and it can be misbehaving in a less scary way, like it can be just crashing your app. It can be using lots of battery. You're shipping an SDK with your app, it's your code, so you are responsible. And the same applies to privacy. So if you have some data breach that's caused by an SDK, it's not correct for you to say, oh, but it's the SDK. No, it's your code. So you're shipping it, it's your responsibility. Now we're talking about iOS apps. There is a way for us to store user data in the cloud without us having access to it and without us having to have the responsibility for it, at least not when it's in the cloud. And that's, of course, iCloud. And iCloud is exposed to us for iOS developers as CloudKit. And I really love CloudKit. It's used by these Apple apps and many, many, many more, and many system features as well. So it's going to be kept around. Someone asked recently, not that recently, last year, after WWDC, oh, there was no session on CloudKit this year. Does this mean it's canceled? No, it's not. We're not talking about AirPower here. Q AirPower charging sound. So with CloudKit, data you store on the user's private database is private. It's user data, and you can't even see it. You can access your own data using the CloudKit dashboard for debugging purposes, but you can't see the data of your users. And CloudKit also handles a key aspect of security and privacy, which is authentication. So if your app has a concept of a user that has an account where they store information, you can rely on their iCloud account, which is already set up on their iPhone or iPad or whatever. So you don't have to put up a login or sign-up form. You don't have to worry about two-factor authentication, lost passwords, and most importantly, you don't have to worry about having the responsibility to keep their data safe and private, because Apple is doing that for you. So really consider CloudKit if you are working on an app that needs a cloud solution, especially if it is very iOS or Apple-centric. If you have a website, though, and you want to give your users access to some CloudKit data on a website, or you want to interact with the user's data on your server, you want to do something custom using the data that's in CloudKit, you can use this API from CloudKit on iOS and get an authentication token for that user with iCloud. And on your server, you can call Apple's REST API for CloudKit and get access to your user's data, their user profile, and stuff like that. I get asked this question a lot. Someone asked me about this today, in fact. And the truth is, yeah, there's no built-in SDK on Android for CloudKit, of course, because it's an Apple thing. But you can use CloudKit on Android, and I know of people who are using it. So you can use CloudKit on Android, you can use it on the web. They have a JavaScript SDK for websites, which is very handy. You can also use it in Node.js apps. And on Android, you can use the REST API. You can do pretty much everything you can do using the native iOS SDK for CloudKit, you can do with the REST API. In fact, their SDK, the built-in one on iOS, is just using the REST API under the hood. So there's no excuse. You can use CloudKit anywhere. Another aspect when we're talking about, I've just talked about the cloud, but you should think how much information you want to put in the cloud. Not all information has to be on the cloud, especially if it's your cloud that you have to handle. So I like to keep stuff on device as much as possible, and I also like to use CloudKit as much as possible because that's Apple's cloud and they are taking care of the privacy aspects for me. So examples people usually give for this are like Vision and Core ML examples where you can process machine learning models on device, and that's really nice. But I have an example that came up when I was working on a feature for my app, Chibi Studio. It solves this really pressing issue on the planet, which is how hard it is to make chibis, which are these cute little characters. And we wanted to have a feature where a user can just find a friend of theirs that uses the app and just select a chibi, select their friend, and send a chibi to them, and it arrives as a push notification. And of course, we wanted this to be super nice, so we wanted the person to send the chibi, and we wanted to have a really nice, rich notification with the preview of the chibi and the name of the friend who sent it to you. But this is implemented on our servers. This uses a custom web application we made. But there's the name of the user there, and we don't want to have the user's name on our server. We want to only have an identifier that's the CloudKit identifier for that user, and we don't want to be storing their name on our server. So what we did is when we send this push notification, we send a payload that looks similar to this one. It sends a generic body, like you received a new chibi without any user information, and it sends an extra payload with the user ID of the sender and a template format for the message. And locally on device, our push notification service extension calls into CloudKit and retrieves the name of the sender. And if that fails for some reason, if the extension gets killed or anything like that, the user will just see the original generic notification. But most times, they'll see the nice, rich notification with the username. And we are doing that without having to send the user's real name to our server. Another aspect, even if you're processing data on device, you need to protect that data when it is on the device. And we have the data protection API on iOS. It has these 4 options. You can have complete data protection, meaning that piece of data, that file can't be accessed if the device is locked. You have complete unless open, which means if you have the file open, it's going to keep working even if the user locks the device. The third one, which is until first authentication, means that after the user unlocks the device, after the device has booted, you don't need to worry about it. All files are going to be accessible. And we have none, which you should not use. And if you want to, if your app has sensitive data, of course this depends on your threat model, but you may want to enable the data protection entitlement. You don't need to enable it to get data protection. You just need to enable it if you want to change the default. So the default data protection is complete until first authentication. So until the device is unlocked for the first time. That's the default. If you want to change that for basically every file your app writes, you can use this entitlement. And you can also change for a file, when you write the file to disk using a data blob, you can change the type of data protection using the options parameter. And if you already have a file on disk and you want to modify the data protection for that file, you can use the File Manager API. So two very simple APIs. And again, you don't need the entitlement to use data protection. It's a little bit confusing. You only need to change the entitlement if you want to change what the default is. Another aspect is logging. We log a bunch of data usually in our apps for debugging, for assessing bug reports and stuff like that. And I am a fan of the OS Log API. I am painfully aware that it's very hard to get the logs out of the device, especially if it's not your device. But that's not a problem I face that much in production, so I usually just go for OS Log. But whichever type of logging you're doing, you need to be careful about logging sensitive data. And what I especially like about OS Log is that all data you concatenate into the log message is private by default. So if you use the standard %@ concatenation, it's going to be redacted from the log unless you have a debugger attached, which is the case when you're running your app in Xcode. So you can use the logs fine for debugging, but when it's in production, it's not going to show up in logs. So this is what it looks like as an example. And these are two cases where I use the standard concatenation, and it's replaced by private. If you want to make that visible even in production, you can use this other format string, which explicitly says it's public. And this is, of course, very useful for things such as error messages, which usually are not private and don't contain sensitive information. At least they shouldn't. And if you want to learn more about OS Log, check out this session from WWDC. It's a really good one, and I really recommend you try out OS Log. There's also backups. iOS devices are backed up. The user can back them up on iCloud. They can back them up on iTunes. So you should also think about things your app produces that don't need to be in backups. So maybe you have some cache that can have some sensitive information in there. Maybe you don't need that in backups because you can recreate that information if the user reinstalls your app later, or if they restore from a backup. You can download it from the cloud again. So exclude from backups anything that can be recreated or that can be retrieved again. So this is how you set a specific file to be excluded from backup. It's a throwing API, unfortunately. I've never seen it throw. Maybe if the file doesn't exist, I'm not sure, but this is what you use. You just set the key on URL is excluded from backup. Couldn't be any simpler. So we talked so far about using Apple's cloud solution, about preserving the user's privacy on device. But then there are the times when we need to have our own cloud. And this is perfectly justifiable in many situations. So we should also think about that. And there are these technologies we can use. I'm going to go through them fairly quickly because this is not the focus of the talk. But if you are implementing a backend or someone is making a backend for you, make sure you understand these concepts. So HTTPS is easy. It's so easy that there's actually a website called httpsiseasy.com, which you can visit, and there are tutorials there teaching you how to use HTTPS. It uses Cloudflare, which is a great service, which I'm a huge fan of. So check it out, really recommend it. And of course, HTTPS encrypts data when it's in transit. There's also app transport security, which is about enforcing HTTPS on your app. So app transport security will prevent your app from talking to unencrypted HTTP servers. You might be asking, how do I enable it? Just don't disable it, because it's enabled by default. So if you want, for some very weird reason, to communicate with like a specific domain using HTTP without HTTPS, you can add exception domains. I know it's a little bit painful to go there and configure the info please, but I usually just copy from another project if I need it. But this is not often required. There's also HTTP strict transport security, and this is kind of like app transport security, but for servers. So it sounds like a startup idea, like Uber, but for cats, something like that. So make sure it's enabled on your server as well. It's super easy, and the HTTPS is Easy website teaches you how to do that. There's also SSL pinning, which prevents your app from talking to something that's not your real server. So this prevents proxies and man-in-the-middle attacks. So this is a more advanced thing. I don't suggest you do it willy-nilly. Like you should think about it, because it's a little bit more involved and you can break your app if you don't do it correctly. So be careful about it. Another thing I really like is device check. So if you have an API that's only used by your iOS app, you may want to make sure that the client that's calling the API is a real iOS device that has your app installed. And without device check, that's really tough to do. But with device check, it's quite simple. You use the device check API on device to generate a token for that particular device. And you can send this token to your server when you do a request, like in some HTTP header, for instance. And on your server, you're going to call into an Apple API, a REST API, and pass the token and your API key. And it's going to tell you, is this a real device that has your app installed or not? Is this a fake, someone trying to call your API without using your app? So this is interesting if you want to prevent people from abusing an API that's used by your app to do something they shouldn't. And I really recommend it if you are doing, especially if it's an API that's only going to be consumed by an iOS app. I use this in production. It's working fine. Never had any issues with it. I actually called generate token before every API call. That's recommended by Apple because the token is not guaranteed to be the same between calls. So if you cache the token, it can be invalidated and you can get in trouble. So make sure you generate it often. And I've seen no significant performance decrease by doing that. So that's data. Now let's talk about transparency, which is making sure your users are aware of what's going on in your app. I like this new way that Apple is using to show the privacy aspects of their apps. This is an example from iTunes U. So they have an onboarding screen, which pretty much every app has nowadays, and they have bullet points at the beginning of the privacy policy explaining in human language, not lawyer language, the most important aspects the user must know about privacy and their app. So you can do this as well. You can have like bullet points for users, and you can put the lawyer text below to just to satisfy the legal department's requirements. You should also explain privacy implications when the user goes to use a feature of your app which may have privacy implications that are not obvious. Like, if you have a feature that's sharing your location with a friend, that's obvious that it's going to share your location with a friend. But an example of something that can have privacy implications which is not obvious is sharing a link to a shortcut in the Shortcuts app. And when you try to do that, they give you a really nice dialogue explaining that anyone with access to that link will be able to access what's in that shortcut. because shortcuts can have private information. You can put data on them. There can be API keys, passwords. So it's really important that they added this dialog here. And I actually copied it for my app, and you can copy it as well. So think about hidden privacy implications a specific feature of your app can have. And if there can be, explain that to the user when they go to use the feature. So now let's talk about control. First of all, if you have analytics in your app, give the users an option to disable analytics. That's just nice. Yeah, like the user should be able to disable analytics. And you can even maybe make it opt-in, so it's disabled by default, but I understand that's not feasible in most cases. So at least give the users an option to disable analytics. Shouldn't be too hard to implement. I mean, said everyone always about everything, but yeah, this is like a Boolean in user defaults. So yeah, make sure they have that option. Also give users access to all their data. Don't hide data from the user. It's their data. So if you are collecting some data from the user, and whether it's on the cloud or analytics or locally, give the users like a screen in your settings portion of your app where they can go and see the raw data that's on them. Or at least give the users an option to request a package of their data, like pretty much every service nowadays has, mainly because of GDPR. And the ultimate control you should give users, which is the most important, is data removal. So the user, let's say they are tired of this app thing, it's not for them, they want to move to the mountains and relax, or to the lake here, just give them an option to delete their data from your app and really delete it. Don't just set a Boolean like is deleted equals 1. No, actually delete their data. They're gonna be very happy with you for that. So that's control, and that's what I wanted to talk to you about. So let's recap briefly. So make sure user data is not collected if it's not needed. Make sure it's protected in transit, and also make sure that it's protected when it's stored, whether on device or in the cloud. Have a clear and human-readable privacy policy with bullet points explaining the main principles. And also, you should make sure that the users are aware of privacy implications of using features of your app if they are not clear from the feature itself. And give users control. Let them disable analytics if they want to. Let them download a copy of their data, and let them remove all of their data. So that's it. Thank you very much.